All right. Hello and welcome everyone to the final session of the NZDS Social Science Data Lab in 2. My name is Dennis Cohen and I'm happy to welcome you to today's talk by Theresa Gessler. The Data Lab is an event series here at the Mannheim Center for European Social Research that provides a platform where early career scholars can present tools and methods for the collection, management, analysis, and visualization in the social sciences. In the current fall 2022 semester, the Data Lab is co-organized by myself and Ruba, who's also here in the room with us today. About our speaker today, Theresa Gessler is a junior professor of comparative politics at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. Her work centers on conflicts around democracy, immigration, digitalization, and patterns of party competition. And next to classical political science research methods, her research uses text as data approaches, web scraping, and various types of digital trace data. In today's event, Theresa will present her own research on the legacies of slave ownership in British politics, and she will demonstrate how researchers can leverage Wikidata to retrieve relevant data on political biographies, actors' characteristics, or the networks between them. In the second part of today's event, she will then provide some hands-on applications for data retrieved from Wikidata. Quick disclaimer about the logistics of today's talk. As usual, we're recording our live stream and we're doing so in active speaker mode, which means everybody in the room today, your audio will be recorded if you ask questions, and everybody joining us online, your audio comments will be recorded, and in case your camera is on, so will be your video. If you want to avoid that, feel free to pass me a question on a piece of paper or post it to the Zoom chat and I will gladly read it for you. So with that being said, Theresa, we are so glad to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm happy you all came out for the admittedly slightly boring title of this talk, Finding Political Facts and Relations with Wikidata. This is the first time I'm presenting about Wikidata, and also the first time I'm presenting something about the paper that you see in a bit about slave ownership and the legacies of that. So it's all very much work in progress, but I'm looking forward to hear what you think about it, and also I hope to make you more enthusiastic about Wikidata. That's a slight delay, so I'll always have to adapt to that. So what do I want to talk about? I will start by telling you a little bit about kind of my broader research, because mostly my research is actually on Wikipedia, not Wikidata. And I kind of from that dive into why Wikidata is also interesting. Talking about the specific paper that I want to present, I will first try to give you an idea in a more applied way. So talking about the theory of 6 degrees of separation that kind of inspired us to come up with this, and then talking about how we trace legacies of slave ownership in British politics. And at the end, I have a part on how to query Wikidata, and I also have code that you can download and kind of follow along if you want. With some admittedly rather simple applications, because I thought that's the place to start, but just to kind of show you that this is actually very doable. Okay, starting out. So Dennis already introduced me, so I don't need to say so much. I try to establish that my position is called assistant professor because my university called the junior professor, but they also sell baby t-shirts that have junior professor on them. But either way, I'm at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder, and my research is on democracy, immigration, gender, a lot with text and digital trace data, but also classical data. Frankfurt-Oder has a partner city that is kind of neighboring on the other side of the river, and used to be there used to be one city together, and that city is called Słubice, and it has the only worldwide, to my knowledge, Wikipedia monument. So I'm trying to establish this as the urban legend of I started working on Wikipedia because of this, but I already worked on it before. But anyway, researching Wikipedia is quite an obvious choice because of that. So kind of in general, what I try to do in my work on Wikipedia is to view it not so much as just an online encyclopedia where we can get knowledge from, but much more as a data source. So I'm working on several papers actually, but some of them try to establish kind of what kinds of questions can be asked from Wikipedia. And I try to show that there's kind of, well, different types of data from which we can ask different questions. So most of you might be aware that Wikipedia has lots of articles, and some researchers have looked at these articles to establish kind of what is the bias in these articles, or are certain subjects were presented in a different way. For example, I and other people have looked at gender. Are female politicians portrayed differently than male politicians, for example? Another part where I think there's kind of like a growing interest also is in the area of page views. So Wikipedia records how many people visit certain web pages, and you can kind of use this to trace how is the interest in certain concepts or topics. Like if there's Fridays for Future demonstrations, do people then go on to look for information on climate change, or do they go on to look for information on I don't know, what is Nötigung, for example. So which aspects of or I think in contrast to survey data, where we of course have much more high quality data, this data is a bit more encompassing. So we can kind of look at several aspects of a topic because the data is there anyway. So we can kind of also post hoc think, how was something received? So yeah, I think it has quite a lot of advantages and potential there for political science research as well. And my main project at the moment looks at clickstream data. That's maybe the lesser well-known type of data. So Wikipedia also records how people navigate from one Wikipedia page to another. And basically this way of like, how do users navigate and how do people inform themselves about politics is something that I find very interesting. So I'm trying to somehow treat Wikipedia as a place where politics happens and where politics becomes visible or traceable, so that we can analyze to say something not about Wikipedia, but about politics and about kind of political knowledge and these types of questions. To give you a more concrete example, now I still have to get used to the time lag. I'm trying to look at Wikipedia to see gender bias, not just in content, as I already mentioned. There's also studies that look at networks. For example, a recent study that argues that kind of the pages of females on Wikipedia are also less well connected, making it less likely that people find them, and that many of the feminist interventions we see in online spaces, they're good at creating pages, but they're not good at kind of mitigating this systemic bias. But the part that I focus on is really this bias in user behavior. So trying to see, okay, there are these differences, but how much of these differences are due to the platform and how much of these differences are actually kind of like reinforced by how users use this platform. And for that, I look at the links that are contained in Wikipedia pages and match them to the clickstream data. So this clickstream data records kind of in a given month, how often do users click from article X, for example, Baerbock, to article Y, which might be, I don't know, feminist foreign policy or something. And from that, basically you can argue like, what are the aspects that people find interesting? What are the aspects that people want to find more information about? And I try to scale this up by classifying all links in terms of what are they about. So which sections are they contained in, which aspects of the profile do they detail, and then I look at the effect of gender, but also interactions to kind of show that family content for women is clicked on more, while for men it's political position. I don't want to bore you with regression results or something, but I thought I'd show you, I always use this image in presentations because I find it so somehow striking. So this is aggregated over a period of, I think, 2 years, what people click on when they visit the page of Angela Merkel. What are the most clicked links? And I already tried to classify them into what is more related to family, what is related to her office, and what is kind of trivia. So the most clicked link, and actually each month over this period, is always the page of her husband. And you might think that this is because he's mentioned very prominently, but you actually have to scroll down substantively. So people really actively look for who's her husband and what's going on with him. The second, you might not know him, is her dad. This is the place that is mentioned as she lived there with her husband. Kossengrün is actually the village that her former husband is from. He doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, so people click on the village that he lives in. So you can see somehow this interest also for men. People are very interested in private things, but it's not as striking as for women. So there is kind of an interaction effect that gender reinforces this interest in these kind of social and soft topics. So far, I've only spoken about Wikipedia. The reason I'm not continuing to talk about Wikipedia is that there is already a really good resource from the Social Science Data Lab, written up by Dennis and Nick Baumann, but based on a workshop by Simon Munzert. How long ago? I think 2 years, 3 years?
3.5.
3.5 years ago. And I think, I mean, I looked at it and I think it's still a pretty good entry into how to study politics on and with Wikipedia. And most of these types of data that I've mentioned so far were also mentioned in there. The reason I talk about Wikidata is that I think this is the part where maybe most things have changed or improved since then, because back then it was still fairly difficult to actually query information from there, because there were R packages, but you really had to rely on Wikidata's own query language. While since I think 2 years, there's now an R package that makes it much easier for people with no background in kind of database management, for example. So I thought maybe it's attractive as a topic to talk about again at this point. Okay, I'll try to get started with this. So yeah, encompassing intro to using Wikipedia for political scientists. So what is Wikidata actually? Maybe I ask who of you has heard of it? Okay, not many. So it's good as a starting point to explain it. Basically, it's a sister project of Wikipedia that understands itself as an open knowledge database. So open means it's public domain, so you can use all the information in it, even without quoting it, even for commercial purposes, it's CC0. It's also collaborative, so just like Wikipedia, anyone can edit it. And in a way, because of that, it's also kind of always growing and expanding. Actually, I checked some stats from 1 or 2 years back, and just the growth over time is quite impressive and a lot faster than it is for Wikipedia at the moment. But the main advantage of this is that in contrast to Wikipedia, it tries to be machine readable. And basically it structures its content into statements that are derived from other databases, from other sources, and kind of puts them there in a way that is linked to these sources, so you can find out where does the information come from, but you also have it in this structured and machine readable way. And because of this, it's used not just by Wikipedia. Actually, a lot of the content that you see on Wikipedia, like these info boxes, for example, they are extracted directly from Wikidata, but also lots of other applications, like artificial intelligence applications, use this. I thought I'd show you an example of what a Wikidata entry looks like. This is the one for the CDU. So basically you have kind of this item, CDU, that the article is about. And then you have, they call it statements. Sometimes you would also read facts. And in fact, they are facts, but yeah, they have a very specific form. That's why it's called a statement. So you have certain properties of this. For example, the CDU is an instance of a major party. So kind of you have a categorization of what is this. You have not just what is this, but you have lots of kind of information or data about it. For example, when did it start? You have different variants of names in different languages. You have chairpersons and so on. So lots of kind of information that might be in a way relevant for us if we want to study a political phenomena. To give you a different example, I thought a politician that is not super famous, or that is famous but not kind of politically important, to show you that also these people are covered a lot. Philipp Amthor, the reasonably young CDU politician, and for him you also have stuff like his occupation is politician and lobbyist. The people that he works for are kind of these institutions, like these lobby companies, probably. He used to work for the University of Greifswald, or maybe still does, I don't know. But we also have that he is a member of parliament, in which parliamentary term, for which party, for which electoral district, when did it start, and so on. So we have lots of detail. Yes.
I heard from some colleagues in computer science about dplyr and knowledge graphs. Can you explain to a person who just heard these terms and doesn't really understand whether there's a connection to Wikipedia?
Yes. So I think so. Don't put my words on the. But I'm not 100% sure, but as far as I understood, dplyr is quite similar as a project, but it was started at a different point in time and not directly by Wikimedia. And that's why it has developed slightly differently. But as far as I know, there have been attempts to kind of compare the two and use them as sources for the others. And they both, this idea of knowledge graphs is common to both of them. So this is basically just that you have lots of entities and they are linked in a way that we know their relation. So for example, for Philipp Amthor, we know that his link to the CDU is being a member of. And this would be the same in Wikidata, but also in other types of knowledge graphs. I think Google had its own knowledge graph as well, for example. And they would, you have lots of subject-specific ones that then wouldn't have Philipp Amthor, but this principle of having different entities and having a link, and this link is of a certain type, that is common to all of them. Okay. So far for the example. So some terminology, not trying to be too intense on it, but each Wikidata item has an ID. It's sometimes called QID, and it always starts with a Q. So it's a Q and a certain number. And that is an item. These items can be anything from politicians to parties, but also stuff like some scholarly articles have a Wikidata entry, for example, or years have a Wikidata entry. So what is an entity is quite broad, but it always starts with a Q and has a number. They also have a label and a description, and this is kind of what we then perceive. So for Philipp Amthor, that we saw CDU, this means we see the label of the CDU, but the CDU has an underlying QID. Philipp Amthor has an underlying QID. And these label and descriptions, they don't have to be unique. So you can have several labels or several descriptions that might be equally valid. Just the ID is unique and helps you to really identify what is this entity. And then for each of these items, you have statements about this item. So, and they're always, and this is this knowledge graph stuff that I was referring to, they always have a property. For example, here I listed as an example the property P39, which is the property of, if you click on it, going to recur throughout the talk. That's why maybe it's actually good to show it. Oh, okay, I mistyped the link anyway. So it's the property of being a member of, and then there can be, or holding an office, and then there can be another property like the specific parliament that you're a member of. So in a way, there's always kind of, there's the type of link, and then there's a value for that link. On Wikidata, you find all these items, like you find the label, you find the identifier behind it, you have a description that is not necessarily unique, and then you have these statements, like the property of being educated at a certain place, that might then have one or several values. For example, Douglas Adams, which Wikidata always uses to explain the categories, was educated at a certain college, but also at a certain school. And there might be kind of references, or there are usually references, because Wikidata puts a lot of emphasis on the statements being verifiable. So there are references that you could check kind of where does this information come from. Okay, so the main contrast is that basically Wikipedia aims at writing continuous text or flowing text that we as humans can read. Wikidata is machine readable and always has these links, both kind of in itself and to other databases. Wikidata is much bigger. So the English Wikipedia, which is the largest, has about 6 million items. Wikidata has about, I think, over 100 million by now, but it's kind of growing continuously. So you never know how many have been added in the meantime. So it's much bigger. Of course, many of them are not necessarily meaningful for us, but in principle, there's more there. This is also because Wikipedia has all these standards for what an item or what an article subject needs to fulfill. So maybe you've heard about notability, that sometimes Wikipedia articles are deleted because people are considered not important enough because, I don't know, they're a local politician or something. Wikidata doesn't have that type of standard. So because of that, in principle, things that might not be considered important enough can be in Wikidata. It still has some other standards that it shares, like verifiability. I already mentioned this. So every statement that is on there needs to have a source of some sort. And of course, some of the biases that scholars have pointed out for Wikipedia. So for example, that famous people are more likely to have an article because we're more likely to be interested in them and we're more likely to be interested in editing articles about them. That's of course also true for Wikidata, because in a way, I'm not gonna like spend my evening creating articles about someone I don't find important. So there needs to be someone who feels like this person matters in order for the entry to come into existence. I put a link on here. Maybe I just show you kind of the file. I see the Zoom control panel. So this is the statistics page of Wikidata, and just to show you that the share of humans among kind of who is on Wikipedia is actually just 9%. So in a way, kind of the universe is much bigger than what we are probably most interested in, assuming that this is for most of you kind of political actors. So in a way, there's a lot of stuff in there that you might never come in contact with. Okay, so how can we then use this kind of for research? There's basically two main ways that this has been used or is being used. One is as information about legislators, about activists, about organizations, about constituencies, and basically extracting properties of these entities as information and basically kind of sparing ourselves the process of hand coding this information by instead looking for it there. I skipped this. The most prominent example of this was actually also mentioned in Simon Munzer's talk. They created an R package called Legislator that kind of extracts this information from Wikidata. They also verified it. So in their package, you will find not just what is in Wikidata, but they added some things like linking it to other data sets that are commonly used in political science and so on. So it's, I don't want to say it's just Wikidata, but it's based on Wikidata, and it's probably kind of the most used data set coming from Wikidata. It's called the Comparative Legislative Dataset and Database, and this R package is basically just the interface. Another way to use this, now I'm skipping back, is to think not of properties, but think of relations. And there, not or relations and networks, and there not so much work has been done. So one person's work I want to highlight is Ömer Yalçin, who looks at elite networks worldwide, and he's trying to show, I think this was PhD research, and he recently put up a working paper on OSF that I linked here, but you'll also find it if you look for the title. Where he looks at elite networks and shows that elites within authoritarian countries are more likely to be connected by kinship ties compared to more democratic countries where the networks are kind of wider and kinship is less present. So basically, he uses it to study how does political recruitment happen and how kind of closely connected are these elites. And we, in trying to look at kind of slave ownership and its legacies, are trying to do something similar, because we also look at what are the relations and how do these slave owners in the past relate to politicians up to present day times. Okay. First, I try to build an intuition, and this is actually how it started for us as well. So Joe Kendall, who is my co-author on the paper that I want to talk about, I have him on the slide in a few slides, came to me asking me about this idea or about this theory of 6 degrees of separation. Maybe you've also heard about it. The idea is that every person can be connected to every other person on the globe within 6 degrees of separation. So I know someone who knows someone. For example, I already knew Dennis and Verena, and they already knew all of you. So I'm probably connected to all of you by within kind of one node connection. And there's a game where people kind of play this on Wikipedia. So I thought I'd try this out with you. How many kind of steps do you think you need to come from the Wikipedia article of Mannheim to the Wikipedia article of Frankfurt Oder, where I'm working? Guesses?
2.
Even less, actually, just 1. You probably can't see it so well on this link, but the links are quite diverse. So there's lots of links how you can get from Mannheim to Frankfurt Oder within just 1 degree of connection, but some of them don't seem so meaningful. For example, one category is list of municipalities in Germany, which tells us they are similar, but it doesn't really tell us that they're related, because if you think about relation, we probably think of something like they have the same twin city or something like that. I have a different example. How many steps do you need to get from Mannheim to checkered garter snake? I have to say the game suggested this. I didn't come up with it. I had to look up what this snake looked like. So it's a reptile, not very famous. But just to show you, like, from Mannheim to a very kind of different type of concept. Any guesses? Cool. Pretty good, actually. So we can get there within kind of with 3 intermediate degrees. So 4 steps exactly. And you again probably can't see it very well, but it kind of goes via different types of links. This one, for example, says vehicle registration office, or here we have necrophilia, or here we have Yellowstone National Park in between. So in a way, these paths are quite diverse and might not necessarily always be meaningful. So kind of the big question that comes from this is, what relations are actually meaningful? And that's kind of where we started our discussion, that we wanted to do something like this, like looking at, can we find connections via Wikipedia, but we wanted these connections to be meaningful. And this is where kind of Wikidata came in for us. So we looked at which relations are actually meaningful, and one last time, David Cameron to slavery.
0.
Not directly, but 1 degree. Actually, he does have ancestors. I think the ancestor is not listed on here in the links, but he does have. There was like a big article about kind of his past connections to slave ownership families. But here also in this case, we have links like prison food, gap year, parental leave, multiculturalism. But we also have some historical personalities, like we have the 3rd Viscount Palmerston. And this, for example, might be more promising for us, because this might be like really that the links to a person, maybe that's a common ancestor or something. So in a way, this is kind of what we're trying to get at. And this is, of course, where Wikidata helps us to scale this up, because this way we kind of know what is the link, like why does David Cameron have this link to cultural assimilation? What is their relation? And what is then the relation of cultural assimilation to slavery, for example? Okay, so this is my co-author who can't be here, but who also is very much, so I already mentioned that his PhD dissertation is on these legacies, so he's very much the substantive head of this project. And we tried to do this with Wikidata. The general argument is kind of that legacies of institutions like slavery have shaped modern societies, including the UK, which is the country that he focuses most on. And in his PhD research, he has shown that this happens through different kinds of ties. Mostly the literature has kind of focused on dynastic ties, but there's a consensus that somehow other types of social ties also seem to be relevant, but they're much more difficult to actually trace. And there's also a lot of ties just through wealth. And this is also why we think this is generally important, because in many countries, including the UK, people who were slave owners and when slavery ended were compensated with quite a lot of money. And for many people, this started their political career. And this is why we think it's somehow important, because if this money is what enabled them to stay in politics and to have political career, this might have shaped kind of many political decisions that followed from that. And we are actually looking specifically at the link of people who were compensated for kind of losing their property to then people who were successful in politics later on. While this is kind of generally well known as a mechanism, quantitative research on this is pretty limited. This is especially in the UK, and we think that it's in part because just the legacies are less discernible, because in contrast to some other countries, the UK didn't have so it didn't have domestic cattle slavery, but most of the slaves were held in territories abroad. So in a way, just it's less visible that this was something that was shaping society. And not just in the UK, but in many other countries also, it's just pretty difficult to quantify these networks. So we can find these links like, okay, David Cameron had this ancestor so and so many generations ago, but to really say how prevalent is this and does this have an impact on how these people then make political decisions, that's much more difficult to quantify because we just don't have a kind of continuous measure of how connected to slavery is a person versus another person. So we're trying in this project to, on the one hand, show the patterns of elite persistence, but also basically develop a methodological tool that helps us show the proximity of politicians today to people who benefited from these institutions in the past. How do we do this then in practice? We collect Wikidata IDs for slave owners who were compensated when they lost their slaves, and British MPs. And then in the next step, we download all the property statements that we have about these people. And basically, this is kind of an iterative process. So we start from the side of the slave owners, download all the properties that they have. We then select only those properties that we consider relevant. For us at the moment, so we're of course still working a bit on this because it's work in progress, but at the moment we try to focus on family, we try to focus on business connections. So for example, there's a category being in business with, academic connections, so doctoral advisor and doctoral student is also in there. We thought about sports clubs, but it's a bit more difficult to operationalize because being a member might not mean that you're in the same club at the same time. So this is still a bit kind of in progress whether we can include that in a way. So we filter these relations that we downloaded in the first step, and then kind of do a second iteration from all these people that we now have in the data set, which are, I don't know, several times as many as we had slave owners, we download another set of connections and properties. And we do this iteratively for 6 steps, basically always deduplicating, of course, because some of these dyads might appear several times, but kind of growing the network in each step. And then based on this, we can kind of estimate how many degrees away from a slave owner is a given MP. But we can, of course, also calculate kind of intensity measures. So how many connections to slave owners does a specific MP have compared to the other ones? Overall, we have about 55,000 MP terms. So it's only 16,000 unique MPs, but of course, several of them were in parliament for several years. And for us, kind of the result that I'm going to show you, which is one of our first results, is kind of the share of people in parliament who had these connections. So for that, of course, each MP is relevant each term that they have. And we link them to only about 1,600 slave owners that are from the given time period when compensation happened, that actually received compensation and that have Wikidata entries. For each of these slave owners, so kind of for this first step, we have somewhere between 300 and 500 properties. I forgot to put the mean on here and I actually don't remember it, but I can look it up. But you see there's quite a variation. So some people we know hardly anything about some people we basically kind of have a really intensive picture. So of course this bias of who is well represented on there is present there as well. And then we kind of keep building this network. So with each step, it grows to like basically becomes roughly 3 times as big as it was in the previous step. But over time, kind of the more connections we have, also the share of links from MPs to slave owners that we can establish with this decreases. So in a way, I think this 6 step or the 6 6 degrees theory really holds in the sense of we only did it up to the 6th degree, but the return was decreasing in each round. So the second round is still better than the first, but afterwards, each round we establish less and less connection. And of course, we're also less meaningful. Kind of being 6 steps away is much less meaningful than having a direct connection. A sneak peek of the properties that are most frequently included in our data. So this is actually how many of these relations do we find. I don't want to go too much into detail, but maybe interesting to highlight is some asymmetries, for example, doctoral student and doctoral advisor. And I think this is due to kind of how this data came together. Of course, we're much more likely to code that someone was the doctoral student of X versus being the doctoral advisor of Y, because we might have advised much more people than we studied at. And generally, you already see that family is quite present in there. And this is, of course, because I think records are quite good for family, but also because this is somehow considered a more important property. While military branch or noble title, these are sometimes quite specific titles that may be not considered as important by contributors to Wikidata. Cohabitant, I also thought was interesting, but it's also like 400 instances in the data, step-parent, godparent, and so on. Okay, some preliminary results. This is just the 1st degree, and this could actually kind of make us feel like slavery is really something that is long in the past. So this is the share in red of people who are connected 1st degree to a slave owner. In blue, people who actually own slaves or were compensated in some ways. And you see that basically by 1900, this is kind of has almost vanished. And at the high point, this is a bit higher than 10% of the MPs. So it seems like a much more marginal phenomenon. However, when we collected more data to kind of also look at these other connections that are several steps away, of course, with each step, the number of people who are somehow involved in this in a more closer distant manner really goes up. So going up to 6 connections, we at a certain point reach, I think, around 75% of MPs who have some type of connection. And using this also more distant operationalization, of course, this is something that still continues to the present day because these links are still there, kind of going through, of course, several steps, because by now you can't be the child anymore, but you could be the grandchild or something like that. Okay, we have some more detailed results, like we try to look at what are the different parties and so on. And I mean, we can't say much definite yet because we're still in the process of coding with. For some of the older MPs, like for the 19th century, data on party membership is not as good and so on. What I can say is that we find that it's mostly the Conservative Party that kind of propels this forward. And family relations are really also in who links to slave ownership, the most important thing. But there again, we still have to see a bit how much of this is a bias of the data and what was put in there versus what is actually a reflection of the underlying reality. So overall, I think maybe outlining some of the challenges first before saying some of the good things. Wikidata, of course, only can accumulate data that already exists. So we're not going to find out connections that no one knows about. We're basically just finding them in a more aggregate way and making them making it easy. It's easier to use this than to employ an army of research assistants who go to libraries and code stuff for us. However, especially for historical research, there might just be things that never make it on Wikidata, and family relations might be kind of the best recorded data compared to other types of relations. The data quality, of course, also depends on the subject. I found it to be actually surprisingly good. So we checked some, we did spot checks, of course, extensively, and we were quite positively surprised by the coverage, especially given that we look so far in the past. But of course, this might be different for other countries. For the UK, for example, there's really a bunch of people on Wikidata who are editors who actively try to make the UK data better and so on. So this might vary. And of course, this notability bias exists to some extent. I've shown you kind of the discrepancy between 300 and 500 properties for a single person. And there's, of course, also some conceptual challenges. So some of the things that we're still working through are that some of these links are really asymmetrical. And we started kind of looking only in one direction because we thought chronologically, we want to follow a chain from the people who were compensated to people who made it into parliament. But of course, there's certain relations like being a member of a sports club or being a member of a party that are only coded for the person who's the member and not the unit that is there. But the same for the doctoral advisors and so on, where the relation is kind of mutual, but still much more likely to be coded one way. So in a way, I think we need to really move towards this knowledge graph structure, while for now we have mostly been thinking about paths. But to really make full use of this data, we have to think of it not being coded symmetrically, but actually the relations are still symmetrically there quite often. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. To say some of the positive things, I think it's really open, accessible, and growing quite rapidly. So in a way, I think, especially with the links to other sources, so for example, for us, we had links to other data sets where we could obtain additional information, biographies, and so on. It's really something that presents just a huge data source that can be used. It's also multilingual, and this is something that Omar Yeltsin, for example, highlights in his research, because he's more, we're looking at one country, but he's looking comparatively, and there this is really a key advantage because you're much less likely to find data about places distant from Europe, coded by European editors. But in Wikidata, this problem is not so grave because people can edit in their own language and you can see it in other languages as well. And I think overall, the idea that you can get statements quite easily, that you can get relations, but that you can also qualify these relations by the type of properties is really something that's quite kind of promising for research. I would first ask if you have questions. If not, I have a few slides on kind of practical examples on how to query this, but I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have for us. Yeah.
Really interesting research, I'll say. Is there any standardized way to see how many degrees matter, or a way to look at it not like, oh, not to argue, it's like, oh, we think like after 4 degrees, it's through like weak connection, after 2 degrees, was it like somebody looked at this situation in a way before?
So, I mean, there have been studies on whether 6 degrees of separation should really be 6 or a different number, but they were not on Wikipedia. So this was kind of on general properties of social networks. So I don't think I can answer it for Wikidata specifically. I mean, for us, it was really just a question of decreasing returns, basically seeing that we don't get kind of much new involvement anymore, and that we kind of repeatedly see the same diets. But for Wikidata, I mean, I think like analytically from a network science perspective, yes, I think this would be measurable, of course, but I don't know of a paper that has done this explicitly for Wikidata. And I think it would always depend, of course, on the types of properties that you're looking at. So I think referring to a study that does this, for example, for actresses, would not make our case much stronger. So in a way, I think this is really subject specific. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a super cool project. And you already said that you sort of did some kind of eyeballing analysis of the coverage rate, and it seemed quite good. But do you have any further intuition about kind of selection biases that could be present? Like, for example, I mean, because you probably have like lists from the parliament about all the MPs, right? So you can kind of compare, because I think like 2 or probably by now 3 years ago, when I was kind of merging the biographic data to speech data, I was also exploring different sources on members of the European Parliament that were out there. And so I came across Wikidata and basically scraped this, and then I scraped the same kind of MPs from the website, and there it seemed quite like random who was missing, but also maybe also you said there's like a big growth in Wikidata, so maybe the sort of the scope is a lot bigger now, because back then I found it had like too many missings basically to really work with it as a source and kind of trust the results.
Mm-hmm. So for the MPs, I think we haven't found any MPs that are not in there. For the slave owners, it's a bit different. So there we have people for whom we just didn't find an entry. And we're not, so I have to say, I mean, given this is not my core topic of research, I also struggle more there, because some of these people have names that are super similar to others. So we try to kind of find, because there's a list that kind of, there's a list of entities that are on the so our universe of cases is basically these people who were compensated, and there's a Wikidata property of being in this data set of people who were compensated. And there we can tell that people are missing, but we don't know if they're actually in there and just not marked as such or something like this. So we don't have a complete guess on that side, but there it's more spotty. But it's also because, I mean, about some of these people, so I've looked at other historical sources, and about some of these people, we really hardly know anything except their name, where they were born, and because some were kind of the direct descendants, and then it's like a daughter who fell into oblivion, and then she doesn't have a Wikidata entry. Members of European Parliament are by now also quite good, because for most of these parliaments, there's actually kind of communities within Wikidata that try to put these entries online. Actually, one of my examples is on that. So, yeah.
I was wondering, with this specific example, or more generally, the type of relational data that you can recover from Wikidata, moving beyond this explorative data mining exercise, do you think it's straightforward to use these data then for more, let's say, classical deductive associational analyses? So would it be easy, well, easy is not the right word, would it be doable to use these data and to transform them into valid and reliable measures that you could then connect to, data on, let's say, parliamentary, legislative voting or parliamentary speech, which you probably don't have an historical perspective, but generally speaking, you think it would be feasible to transform these data into measures that you would then use for additional analysis?
That is very much what we want to do. So, I mean, our first attempt was to kind of look at electoral success, but we had problems with preceding trends and people who were compensated already being slightly more electorally successful, so that we couldn't use, but the initial plan was to kind of look at this. But we still very much want to look at how does this affect their speeches, especially kind of in the time directly after, because for the UK, a lot of historical speech data is actually available. How does this affect voting behavior? So we are confident, we can't tell you the results yet, but we are confident that this is possible. And I mean, of course, like this is a very specific application. If you choose something a bit more recent, I think also coverage might be, in a way, this is a hard case. I mean, it's easy because it's the UK compared to Luxembourg or something, but it's also hard because it's so far in the past. Okay.
Dennis, there's something in the chat. I'm not sure that's you.
That was me encouraging people to ask questions.
Okay, I first wanted to show you kind of how Wikidata's own native language for querying looks like. It's called Sparkle, and it's a type of query language for databases. So it's quite related to stuff like SQL, but it's distinct from that. So it has its own syntax in a way. And this has been there kind of to use for quite a while. Actually, Wikidata also provides provides an online query service where you can put these types of requests in and get results online, but you can also use it in R with this Wikidata query service R package. And a query might look something like this. This is a very simple query asking for members of the European Parliament. So in a way, I think it's not overly complicated, but it puts kind of the hurdle to actually just try this out for fun quite high, I would say, because kind of you have to actually engage with this. There's lots of examples, but I think for political scientists, what's much more attractive is that since 2020, I think there's this package called tidywikidatar that helps to download data in a tidy format into R. And that's really kind of intuitive. I mean, it still uses these types of property labels and these QIDs, but everything else is very much in standard R syntax. So this is also what I kind of wrote the examples in. If you want to download the code, I hope I managed to put it on my web page so that you can, if you want to follow the script, just follow it line by line instead of typing the code. I'm a big fan of the package, I have to say, because I think it really makes things much easier. And for people who just want to explore what is actually there on the subject that I'm interested in, this is a great entry point. But you will realize that if you use this a lot, or if you have more complex queries, some things are just not doable with this because you can't do as nuanced queries. The speed is a bit slower. So in cases like for ours, for our case, where we've been downloading like several millions of items before filtering and so on, this was quite tedious to use. So that we also kind of went back to the original query language at times. But as a starting point, I think this is great. So for example, the European Parliament, we can basically build a query using tw_query, and then just giving it the property type and kind of the item that something is that the property relates to. I had to get up very early to get here this morning. So basically we can just tell it that we are looking for people who held a public office, and this public office is being a member of the European Parliament. For political scientists, this property P39 is anyway super interesting. That's why I highlighted it in the beginning, because almost all types of political office are coded as P39. So I mentioned Ömer Yalçın's paper, and he basically just looks at people who have this P39 property filled in. There's some more specialized properties like for ministers and so on, but really a lot of public offices and a lot of the things that we would consider political elites are encoded by this P39, while non-political offices aren't really. or non-public offices. I'm not sure what would be an example. So officially it's called position held, but this would not be used for a position in a private club or something. So position held is really just for public office. And basically with this query, just asking for holding this office and the office being the European Parliament, we can get, I don't know how many it is in total, I forgot, maybe I'll do it in R. While I talk to you. We run the query and it takes a little bit. I already told you it's a bit slow. We get the members of the European Parliament that are on this platform, that are 4,601 in total. I don't know whether this is more or not much more than it used to be, Verena.
Yeah, I tried to find my folder on my computer, so I don't really.
And this is, of course, only the unique members of Parliament. So kind of you have to mentally multiply it by the terms that they were in office. We could also ask for this, and this is actually the code that I had shown you before with this Wikidata query service syntax, or the kind of original syntax that is used by the database. And now that you've seen it once in our syntax, it might be easier to read this. We use the same property label here, P39, and we use kind of the same being a member of the European Parliament, but we have to tell it more specifically what we want, namely the item, the label of it, and the description. So that was, for example, for Sarkozy, president. And we have to label it, because otherwise we just get this Q something number back of the person who was a member. And we can decide what language. By default, so I put it in English, but you could choose other languages as well. Okay, so far so good. We might also build more complex queries, and this is really what that is an advantage for. So I didn't dare to write a very complex query, so I copied one from this example wiki project on British politicians, and I thought I'd walk you through it, so you get a bit more of an intuition about it. So this is the same type of query as we had for the European Parliament, but we're asking only for unique entries. This is why we say select distinct instead of select. And we ask this time for different properties. So not just the item and its label and its description, but we ask for the party label. I have to stare at this while I talk, sorry. The party label, the election, when did the term start, the term in office, when did it end, for what reason did it end. So here we're asking for all positions that were held by this person. And we say that this should be recorded in a variable that is called position statement. And we only have those positions that are being a member of the UK Parliament. This is what the statement in bracket kind of narrows it down or filters it down to. And when we say it should record as different types of variables, other kind of aspects of the property, aspects of the properties of the item. For example, it should record as constituency the value for the property 768. So, or it should record as party the value for the variable P 4100. So, I don't know, I think it's a bit counterintuitive, but when you look at it for a while, it kind of becomes a bit clearer that here you kind of you use the properties from Wikidata, you give it a name, and you tell it at the top that it should extract these. Of course, this is kind of, the more complex way. So if you would want to have an easier time, but we don't mind to collect more data, we could also just collect all properties and then filter afterwards. But basically, this is the reason why it's sometimes still worth to learn this Sparkle query language if you actually have if you actually end up wanting to use Wikidata in a project, because then you can just be much more precise and kind of really only collect the data that you want. Instead of doing these complex versions, some more kind of easy or simple examples. Quite often, we don't want to start with Wikidata, but we want to start with Wikipedia, because this is somehow what we are all more used to using. And in tidywikidatar, there's also a function how we can start from Wikipedia. That basically just takes a Wikipedia page, like one of these lists of people, in this case, who were members of the European Parliament elected from Germany in the current term, and then it extracts all the links from that. So there's a function, get Wikipedia page links, that just takes all the links that are on this page. I have to scroll on the slide, but you should also have it in the code. Of course, if we execute that, we get kind of where does this come from, what was the address of that, what is the QID of the source of the original page, and what is the QID of the items that we've collected from that. But here we're of course collecting all items, because we haven't told it that what we really want is only the MPs. So if you would visit that page with lists of members, you see quickly that there are these members, but there's also a link to European Parliament, to Germany, to the specific session, and so on. So if we start from Wikipedia, we quite often have to filter. So this is also to exemplify, we get other links as well. So we have to filter by filtering to some type of meaningful entries. If we've already before collected all MEPs, we could just use that. So we filter only those that were in the MEPs, but otherwise we might also do stuff like, here I asked it to give me the property, what type of content is that? So being an instance of, and then I only kept the values that are humans. So with this, we throw away kind of parliamentary term, we throw away Germany, and so on. But like if you're a critical thinker, you might already say this might not always work, of course. So this is something that requires you to do a bit more checks, because you don't know whether maybe for some reason French MEPs are also mentioned on this page. So I think this is a bit more kind of a trial and error process until you really found like what are the identifiers that help me to filter to only what I want. But it's still much faster, of course, than kind of typing out all the names or something. So I think still quite helpful as a starting point, because also if you start from all MEPs, you wouldn't know which ones are German, and Wikidata doesn't have a German MEP category. You would have to go via MEPs and then filter to the German ones. So sometimes it can be useful to kind of have these two different entry points. So far we have the MEPs, but we don't know anything about them. And this is how, this is where getting these properties, so getting kind of the information about them that is contained on Wikidata becomes relevant. And this is with twyget. So this just gets us all properties. So different from the query that I showed you before with the parliamentary terms of this specific person, Winston Churchill. Here we're collecting all types of properties that are recorded for all of these German MEPs. And you can see that, I mean, it just starts with the first one, who's Alexandra Gessler, and there's a lot of statements about her that are in there. To give you an idea, I just kind of tallied them and arranged them so that you can see what are the most frequently filled in properties. And of course, the most frequent one is position held, like member of the European Parliament. They might have been member of another parliament before, and so on. But we also have occupation, we have social media followers, work location, party membership, country of citizenship, languages spoken, which might be interesting. We have links to other data sets. maybe something that is not on the top 20 properties, but that I picked out because I thought it shows kind of the advantage of this over other data sets is that it already has an identifier for must-read-on IDs, which most, like if you look at every politician, which is of course not so active anymore anyway, but kind of these conventional data sets typically don't have that yet. So I filtered it by the property for must-read-on ID, and I got 72 must-read-on IDs for these, I think it was 97 members of the European Parliament coming from Germany. Maybe you see that here it says deprecated, which as an R user is always a warning sign. This is a label that Wikidata uses if it's not sure about the quality of the data source. So in this case, I'm not sure, it wasn't there when I first checked it. It was there now when I reran the slides. I think it might be because, yeah, these IDs are changing a lot still at the moment, and you don't know whether people deregister or whatever. Wait. So in a way, I think, yeah, like when I realized they had this, I thought, okay, this is actually, especially if you're working kind of on up-to-date stuff, this is really a very good advantage. I have some kind of more, I don't know how energetic you are for examples, but I have on the slide some more code on being a member of the European Council, which is not recorded in Wikidata because it's not a proper institution, or it doesn't have kind of its own property. But we can again get it from the web from Wikipedia and then kind of filter with instance and being an instance of, and then the instance has to be human. So kind of the same principle of filtering. But I also just for kind of comparison purposes put on an example that being a judge at the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany is recorded in there as well. For these people, the properties are in some way similar, but also a bit different from the politicians. So you have a lot of occupation, you have a lot of awards received, which isn't so prominent for politicians. Languages spoken is also in there. I think somewhere it says educated at, I'm not sure, don't find it. I also did it for the Supreme Court, and there it does say educated at. It's like one of the top properties. So just to give you an idea, the different types or the different kind of classes of people have different properties that people kind of consider important. And I thought here, I mean, I don't work on judicial politics, but which universities did people go to is quite often a topic when you talk about diversity in US judges, for example, and this would be something where Wikidata would obviously be a good source just because it's very easy to access rather than going through the biographies. Okay, so all in all, I think this tidywikidatar that most of the examples were based on is a really good entry point to just give you an idea. Is this useful for me? Is this even feasible? Is the data that I'm interested in actually there, or are there too big gaps in coverage? But it's incomplete in some ways. So sometimes when you have several sources, only one source is included, some of the qualifiers, it doesn't download. Some of the more complex queries you can't build. So in a way, kind of, it's an entry point, but for everything further, then this kind of original query service becomes more attractive. Because of that, on, I think the last, no, not last, but almost last slide, I put a few links. I don't know if you ever upload the slide. Yes, okay, so you will see them on the uploaded slide, with kind of Wikidata's own resources on introductions to this, some kind of videos that really quickly walk you through the different things. There's even a tour where it kind of annotates the entries and you see like what could be changed where, how would you edit, what type of data is in there. And there's also a lot of great examples on kind of how to build queries where you can really like look at it and try to adapt this to your case. there's a query builder that interactively lets you select stuff. Like I want things, like I want members of a sports team that have the value, I'm looking for some sports team, Boston Celtics or something. So you could do something like this, even build queries like that. I don't like it so much because it produces more complex queries when necessary. And I think for beginners, it's difficult to afterwards simplify them. So my recommendation would really be to instead start from the examples and adapt them, then use this query builder, which might give you something where you're not exactly sure what you get then as an outcome. Okay, so overall, I hope I convinced you that Wikidata is an interesting and in a way also powerful tool because there's so much information at our hand. That tidywikidatar is a good entry point, but there's also kind of more complex stuff. And I think I've already 5 times said that qualifying these relations by their type is, in my view, the key advantage of this versus just establishing links. So I'll just say thanks instead of repeating myself.
All right, that leaves us with a little over 15 minutes for questions and comments. I can start. First of all, thanks for the wonderful talk. Super exciting work, both the set of application as well as the walkthrough to data queries using Wikidata. My question would be, so I mean, I totally understand the structure, how you can query different items and how then the levels of those items might be items in and of themselves. So for example, educated for British MPs might have Eton College or Oxford and Cambridge University most of the time, I presume, which are items in Wikidata themselves. But sometimes it's a dead end in the sense that the level isn't in and of itself another item on Wikidata, right? But just a string of characters. And I was wondering, are these standardized in any way, or do you get pretty much random language input that may or may not be coherent with one another? So one example was, for example, when you had the descriptions of these members of European Parliament that had official offices. I think in one case it said Italian president or French statesman. So statesman and president can mean one or the same thing, but they still use different words. And I was wondering whether that requires some sort of post hoc manual harmonization, or if there's any way to ensure that these are automatically using compatible levels.
I'm just going back to make sure I don't tell you something wrong. So this is the description. This is one of the few things that are not unique and that are not a Wikidata entry, but that are meant to be human readable. So if you remember, like for Philipp Amthor, it said politician and lobbyist. And that would be the equivalent. So this is a description of François Hollande that someone came up with at a certain point in time. But within his biography, there's also, I'm fairly sure, like 99% sure, there would also be an entry that kind of has what makes him an official and what makes him a statesman. So for Philipp Amthor, you had this as a description, but you also had an entry that he works as a like you had jobs and it had politician and lobbyist. So this is really an exception. This is the only instance where you get a string. Otherwise, it's basically always a Wikidata item. Only label and description are strings. But well spotted. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks again for the good talk. I just wondering regarding like the quality of the data or like verification of the data was like being open source or like from collaboratively, like is this any QC or like did you have to go like to check in any way or
so I would say it's not worse than other social science data for sure. So there's people, I think there's assessments like this for Wikidata as well, but I don't know them because, as I said, most of my work is on Wikipedia, so I'm also quite new on Wikidata. But for Wikipedia, there have been like several comparative assessments comparing it to the British Encyclopedia and so on. And on average, because people check stuff and because you have to make references, and if you don't include a reference, the information is going to be removed, the quality is quite high. And none of our data is perfect. So in that sense, I know there might be some error somewhere, like, I don't know, the same person, something might link to a wrong person or something, but I think this is not relevant in terms of overall data quality. Like, this is, I think, as good as other social science data. That would be my position, but of course I'm happy to argue.
A question that may follow up on that. One is, have you had experience with German data? Because you mentioned Wikidata is much better in Germany or other countries than maybe Wikipedia. I mean, in terms of coverage and so. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, do you have a sense of kind of who are those users who edit and do that? Do you know of any studies that kind of looked at demographics or?
Yeah, so maybe on, so the first question was
on German data versus English data.
So what I meant is that Wikidata is in a way more equal than, for example, Wikipedia or other types of information, because in Wikidata, things are automatically included in all language editions, because it's basically like one multilingual database. In contrast to that, Wikipedia, you depend on someone translating this to another language. So you're less likely, I mean, for example, in my work on kind of this politician gender stuff, I looked at the content of articles and I used the German Wikipedia for German politicians and the English Wikipedia for English politicians. And I tried to see kind of, when I was still exploring this, I also looked at, okay, so are these people from the US actually covered in German as well? And of course, articles are much shorter. They're likely to kind of, have less substance. And Wikidata doesn't have that problem because kind of all information is stored in one database. Because of the machine readability, no one needs to translate sentences. So Wikipedia is also moving more towards automatic translations. Some of the fastest growing Wikipedias are actually automatically translated from other languages. So some of the fastest growing language editions, I should say. But of course, there's always bigger gaps then. In terms of where's Wikidata good, I mean, I can only tell you about the things that I looked at. So I work on European politics and there I find it good. I can't tell you much about other cases, but I think in the working paper that I mentioned by Ömer Yalçın, he does some kind of also comparative work and he really argues that it has a comparative value, but of course I haven't checked his work or replicated it. I'm just taking his word here. And your second question?
The users? The editors?
Mm-hmm. There's studies on this, both for Wikipedia and Wikidata. I know them better for Wikipedia than for Wikidata, of course, again. They skew according to kind of the characteristics that you would expect. So they're more male, they're younger, they work in certain professions, they have more kind of disposable income, social capital, and so on. And there's lots of work that looks at internal dynamics. So how are people recruited? How are people kept involved? And so on. But this is really like lots of sociologists especially work on this. I don't know. Of course, this might have an impact on the content, but yeah, I can't say much more about this than that.
We have an excellent question in line from Nino Petriashvili. And the question is it possible to have access to older versions of the same entries on Wikidata? So for example, to see who made what kind of changes and in what frequency entries have been edited?
Good question. I think I can only check this actually, I have to say. I've worked with versions in Wikipedia and where you can get both every past version and you can get individual edits. You know either the user this was attributed to, or if it wasn't by a user, if the person wasn't registered, you get an IP typically. So there you have quite comprehensive coverage, but I don't know view history. Yeah, it seems to be the same for Wikidata. And I would guess that you can probably also get that data with some of the APIs that people use for querying versions for Wikipedia, because they're mostly based on the media wiki, which is kind of the entire family of projects. So I would guess that you can also get these edits. So you could see kind of how these entries develop, especially, I don't know, I think one of the things where people look at this is like more contested concepts, where you can then also, again, have internal or have dynamics of Wikipedia literature on kind of contested entries, like, I don't know, states that that are contested, or history. Yeah, so I think this should be possible, but I haven't done it yet. But you see here, I mean, this is kind of the same type of data that you also get for Wikipedia versions. So I would expect that you can work with that quite well.
Any more questions and comments in the room or online? In that case, Theresa, once again, thank you so much for the time. And thanks everybody in attendance today and online for joining us today and in previous sessions. We will be back in mid-February of next year. In the next spring semester, the Social Science Data Lab has 6 exciting events covering topics such as introduction to Python for social scientists, survey sampling using targeted ads on social media, multiverse analysis, transformer models for language, as well as pre-registration and pre-registered reports. So there's a lot in store for all of you, and we'd be happy if you joined us next year in the NZDA Social Science Data Lab. Thanks again.
Thank you very much also from my side.
We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.